Let's start this week with rockets. When a rocket explodes, most people call it a failure. This is what happened with SpaceX. The Guardian News. SpaceX Starship explodes in second failure for Mars program. In Reuters, SpaceX's Starship explodes in space in second failure this year. In ABC News, SpaceX Starship rocket explodes in latest setback to Musk's Mars mission. But SpaceX uses a very different sentence. From a test like this, success comes from what we learn. Reuters also quoted a former NASA astronaut and SpaceX advisor who called one early Starship explosion a successful failure. Now this idea is interesting. It doesn't say that the failure was good. It doesn't say that the explosion was the goal. It says that a bad result can still teach us something useful. And this is not only about rockets. The same thing happens in work, in creative projects, in relationships, in language learning, and in leadership. Yes, many of us fear failure. Many of us do not fear failure only because of the result. We fear what failure seems to say about us. Maybe other people will judge us. Maybe we will look weak or foolish or not good enough. And yet there are people, organizations, companies, and teams that do not fear failure. So the real question is not only how do we avoid failure, but better questions are these. What makes failure useful instead of frightening? What kind of situation helps people learn from mistakes without judgment? And these are the questions that I want to explore here. And the point is that one reason that failure is hard is not just because of the result. It's also about the meaning. Failure means something. A mistake can feel like a message. Maybe I'm not ready. Maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe others will lose trust in me. Maybe this is not a good place to try. And the point here is that often people feel that failure is not safe. And that's why the fear of failure can stop people before they even try. Now this week's reading was Shippai Suru Kenri from the book Bouken no Sho. This week's reading says something important. People need the right to fail. If a system only tries to stop mistakes, it can also stop real learning. People become too careful, they hide, they follow the safe path, but they don't grow very much. And to build on this, I want to use two simple ideas from education science and management. The first is productive failure. This means that an early struggle or even an early failure can help people learn better. The second is psychological safety. This means people feel safe enough to speak, to try, to ask questions and be wrong in front of others. And when you put those two ideas together, the question about failure changes. Not how do I avoid failure, but what kind of situation makes failure useful? What kind of situation, what kind of community makes failure something that we can learn from? So let's go back to the rocket. If a rocket explodes, that doesn't automatically make the test useful. It's only useful if people can study what happened, speak about what happened honestly, and use that information for the next test. That's why SpaceX can say that success comes from what we learn. And this is close to the idea of productive failure. The failure itself is not the goal. The goal is better understanding after the failure. A difficult first attempt can show what's missing. It can make the next steps, the next required things, much clearer. But there's another side to this. People only learn from failure when they can face failure honestly. If people are afraid, they tend to hide mistakes. They stay quiet. They pretend that they don't understand. They choose the safe answer. And when that happens, failure stops being useful. That's why psychological safety matters. That is, people need a situation where they can say, I think this is wrong. I don't understand yet. We need a better idea. Failure becomes useful when people study it, talk about it honestly, and use it to improve. And here's a good example of that idea of safety in making mistakes. Sarah Blakely is an entrepreneur and the founder of Spanx, a multi-million-dollar clothing brand in the US. She was the youngest self-made billionaire in the US. And she grew up with a very unusual question. Her father asked her and her brother, "What did you fail at this week?" And if they had no answer, he was disappointed. That sounds strange at first, but the message was simple. If you had failed, it meant you had tried. This is psychological safety. Being able to learn from failure, being able to fail and to not be criticized. And Blakely said that this changed her idea of failure. Failure was no longer just a bad result. Failure became not trying at all. And even more importantly, she grew up in a family that made failure feel normal. Failure was part of being human. It was something people could talk about, not something that they had to hide. And that's why this is such a strong example. And it shows how the people around us can help us to face failure honestly. So the real point about failure is quite simple. Failure can help us grow, but only if the situation feels safe to make mistakes. So let's look more deeply at productive failure. This is a concept that was proposed by Kapur, an educational scientist, in 2008. He found that when learners can experience failing first, that can help them learn better later. And this sounds strange because most of us think that failure slows us down. But think about learning a language. Imagine that you are in a real conversation. You try to say something important, but your words don't come out right. Maybe the other person looks confused. That doesn't feel good. That feels like a failure. But that moment can teach you something very clearly. Now you know what doesn't work. You know now where your weak point is, because you felt the problem yourself. When you get feedback, the correction is clearer and means more. The new phrase is easier to remember. This is the basic idea of productive failure. The first attempt fails, but the struggle there helps prepare deeper learning after that. So the point is, did this failure show me something important? And that's why an early mistake can sometimes be more useful than a perfect answer given too soon. But now we need the second idea. When do people feel able to make mistakes? And that's where psychological safety comes in. This was proposed by Amy Edmondson, a management scientist, in 1999. Edmondson uses this idea to describe a situation where people feel safe to take small social risks, like asking a question, sharing a weak idea, admitting a mistake, or saying, "I don't understand yet." And this matters because how we feel about failure is not only about the person who makes the mistake, that is, me making the mistake. How we feel is also about how people around us make us feel about failure. And sometimes we stay quiet not because we have nothing to say. Sometimes we stay quiet. We don't take the risk, not because we have nothing to say or because we have nothing that we want to do, but because we are afraid of what others will say if we make a mistake or if the risk doesn't turn out. Sometimes we hide confusion because we don't want to lose face. Sometimes we give a safe answer or do the safe action even when it's not the best answer or the best action because it feels less socially risky. We feel as though doing that will mean that we won't get criticized. In contrast to this, psychological safety means being in a community where you can try, where you can speak, where you can question and be wrong without being attacked or feeling ashamed. Productive failure is about the learning value of struggle. Psychological safety is about the social conditions that make that struggle possible. Without challenge, we may not learn very much, but without safety, many people will avoid the challenge completely. So the big idea is simple. Failure helps learning. Failure can be productive. And psychological safety helps people face failure honestly. So once again, the question is not how can I avoid failure? The better question is what kind of environment turns failure into learning? Now before we finish, let's look at some real-world examples again. We saw the SpaceX example at the beginning. A rocket explodes, but the test still has value. SpaceX says success comes from what we can learn. Microsoft gives us another. As we saw last week, Satya Nadella pushed Microsoft from a know-it-all company to a learn-it-all company. And Microsoft's language in the Microsoft culture says, we look to failure as our greatest teacher. And here's Facebook. When they were new on the social media scene, their company culture was move fast and break things. They may have ended up breaking a few too many things along the way, but the culture of mistakes and learning was strong. Amazon is another example. They say failure and invention go together. You can't have invention without failure. Those two things just go together. And it's not just foreign companies. Companies in Japan, organizations in Japan also have similar ideas. Sony, they say 失敗を恐れず チャレンジ精神を富む人材. They seek people who are not afraid of failure, that want to go out and challenge themselves. 積水 house, right? Housemakers, they tend to have this image of being very conservative and stuck in their ways. But 積水 house says 失敗を非難するのではなく失敗から学ぶ姿勢を持つ. And it's not only companies that embrace failure. Here's a Japanese government ministry, the digital 庁. Try and error ではなく try and learn. Not try and error, but try and learn. Try first and then learn from the mistakes through that trying. And also 国土交通省, another public organization that has an image of being very stuck in their ways and immovable. But no, they also say this, 試行錯誤, 挑戦を繰り返す. That is baked into their culture and they acknowledge the value of failure. And previously we saw Sarah Blakely, founder of Spanx. She was surrounded by a family environment, and this is the most important thing. She was surrounded by a family environment that made it safe to make mistakes and fail. She was asked, what did you fail at this week? And if she didn't have an answer, her father would be disappointed. Her father was expecting failure, valuing failure. So these examples show the same basic pattern. Failure is not always the enemy. Sometimes the real enemy is fear. Fear makes us hide, stay quiet, play safe, and wait too long. So in this video, I've shown two theories about failure. The theory of productive failure shows that we can learn from failure. The theory of psychological safety suggests that we need an environment that helps us to get the most out of failure, a supportive community that allows us to fail safely. So the goal is not to become somebody who never fails. That's impossible. The goal is to become somebody who can learn, to adjust, and can move on from failure. And we also need to make communities, like Sarah Blakely's family, that make it safe to fail, that make us feel as though we can fail without being ridiculed, without being attacked, without being criticized. And that's where we're going to go next when we meet face-to-face in class. In our Unlearning Lab 2, we're going to explore situations, real situations, where failure feels difficult, risky, or embarrassing. We'll ask why failure shuts people down and what makes failure useful. And we'll think about how we can build communities where people can try and reflect and grow through failure.